Welcome to the show. You are, the perfect guest to have to talk about a Superman movie. You are a Superman fan, first
I'm
and
not
foremost, I
I'm
think,
not a
right?
fan. I'm a mark. Like if you know wrestling terms, I'm a
Absolutely.
mark. Like,
You pop anytime he comes on screen,
oh,
right?
absolutely. Honestly, like Superman is in such regular, like all versions of Superman are in regular rotation in my house. Like my wife and my kid are sick of it at this point. So
And you've got to draw him and his cousin professional. Like you're probably one of your most well-known runs was the run on Supergirl.
yeah. No, I was fortunate. I was very, very lucky to have had the opportunity to work on Supergirl and on Superman and on Action. I've got like a page and a half in Action Comics 900, like which was it was cool, but it was very weird because I'm drawing this scene with Superman and Lex Luthor has these cosmic powers. He's wearing this armor, and they're showing the destruction of New Krypton, and the entire time I'm drawing the scene, I'm thinking in my head, okay, I bet like $100 the person who's following me, because I did a page and a half, like the person who's following me in this book is probably Gary Frank. And I swear to God, Gary does like the very next sequence after.
You set him up. It was
It
like an
was,
alley-oop.
oh yeah, no, it went from Pete Woods to me to Gary Frank. Like it was,
All
kismet.
iconic Superman artists.
Oh
I gotta
yeah,
say,
yeah.
and you are one of them. You are, and I'm glad to call you a friend. And it's fitting that you are on this episode. It's June 2006, all over again.
Mm-hmm.
But
Absolutely.
before we get into Superman Returns, where are you on June 28th, 2006?
Ooh, was I at here? No, Heroes Con was later in the month, I think. Because that's at that point, I'm in the theater. I'd probably seen it like two or three times at this point, and then I saw it again at Heroes Con, like sitting next to Rosario Dawson. Like it was just like a very surreal
It's
period.
gotta be.
Yeah.
Also, a huge comic book nerd.
Yes,
People. I
absolutely.
mean, I guess if you're listening to this podcast, you know Rosario's nerddom
Yeah.
pretty well. So yeah, Superman Returns, big movie, and
Mhm.
and it's starred Brandon Routh, Kate Bosworth, James Marsden, Frank Langella, Parker Posey, and the villain who shall not be named. Directed by the director who shall
Who
not be
shall not
named.
be named.
It's a lot of canceled folks in this
Yeah,
movie.
yeah. I have something. Um, so I'm gonna show you this. So this
Oh,
is the Superman Returns Hot Toys figure.
very rare.
Yes. And again, being the mark that I am, I immediately had to have it as soon as it was available. I think there's only like 10,000 of these.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like super rare.
I mean, there was a lot of merch pre-movie, not a lot of merch since movie, you know?
No, I think it's unfortunately, and we kind of talked about this a little bit pre-show. Unfortunately, I think that the the movie gods have not been quite as kind to Superman Returns as they probably would have been under any other circumstances. But considering how things, even with like those who shall not be named, um, just like the whole production and how it was chopped up in the end by Warner Brothers because of fears of how it would be perceived by the public. And we can get into that later in the podcast. But I know a lot about the production. I know a lot about what the original script looked like. A
Oh
lot of the
yeah, I would
behind
definitely
the
want to get
scenes
into. I mean,
stuff.
talking about canceled, actors and directors, we can't talk about Superman Returns without talking about all of the canceled Superman projects that led
Oh
up to
yeah,
Superman Returns
yeah,
because the movie that we ultimately got was not the original Superman movie. Even the Superman Returns script that you're talking about is a vestige of like four or five failed Superman
right,
projects,
right.
right?
So
Because you had the Superman Reborn, which was I think
it
was
was
that the
Tim.
McGee one?
No. Reborn was Tim Burton, and it was going to star Nicolas Cage. That
Right.
was
That's
the
the Superman
original.
Reborn slash Superman Lives. Right. Right.
Yes. So they had and you might, if you look on YouTube, you will find footage of the costume fitting that they
Yep.
did with Nick Cage.
Yep.
Several costume fittings that they did. There's, the photos of him in the costume, in the plastic armor suit, which was all the rage back then, the electric, resurrection suit that we've all seen footage of at various points. They had gotten close to a shoot date. Like everything was in place. They had art direction. They had people working on sets. They had, props being designed. They had costumes being made. They had, Colleen Atwood was designing the suit. Everything was in place. Cage was working out. They were doing the costume fittings, and then they just contracts ran out, basically, and they decided, Warner Brothers, thinking that Tim Burton's approach would just be way too radical for what they wanted to do, because essentially they were trying to do their own version of the death and return of Superman. And I don't think the people who were in charge of Warner Brothers at the time thought that that was the way to go. I know that certainly wasn't the way that John Peters wanted to go.
And speaking of John Peters, Kevin Smith famously has the story of John Peters' obsession with a giant mechanical robot,
which he finally got in Wild
Spider,
West.
right? Which, and then ultimately we got in The Flash 20 years later, where Nick Cage Superman fights a giant spider, which was totally a shout out to Kevin Smith and John Peters. So that was one project that got developed all the way, to your point, all the way to costume tests and almost shooting before it got abandoned. Then there was the Batman.
I think Mick G came first. Or was it Wolfgang Peterson?
Batman versus Superman, right?
Yes, Wolfgang Peterson.
The original Batman versus Superman, not the one we ultimately got, but the one, the Easter egg that's in I Am Legend with the Batman versus Superman logo. So that was Wolfgang Peterson and Andrew Kevin Walker.
Yeah, and I think they were trying to develop that at the same time they were trying to develop Justice League.
But I think with different actors, because I know that like Jude Law and I think, was that the Josh Hartnett one?
That was the Josh Hartnett one, yes.
Yeah, Josh Hartnett is Superman. I think Jude Law is Batman.
I think Hartnett actually tested a couple of times.
There's a costume photo of him.
Yes, he's tested for a couple of different projects, because I know Henry Cavill tested for the film that we were talking about, right? the McG film, and for Superman Flyby,
right,
which is the J.J. Abrams film.
Right, J.J. Abrams and Brett Which one was Brett Ratner attached to? Was he Flyby, or was he?
He was attached to the McG film after McG dropped out because he didn't want to fly to Australia to film.
Right. And ultimately Brett Ratner and Bryan Singer swapped places, because Brett Ratner took over X-Men 3. Yes. And then Singer eventually comes over to Superman Returns when so all of these projects moved forward. Like Brendan Fraser had screen tests, Josh Hartnett had screen tests, Henry Cavill has a screen test before
he actually tested a few times. Yes. I think even before Superman Returns, Brandon Routh had tested a few times for Superman. Trying to think of who else would have been that age. I think Balthazar Getty even tested a couple of times
there were rumors, and so like I brought this up before we started recording. Back in the early aughts, I was very active on the message boards at superherohype.com. So was Jamal. And the fandom in the pre-Twitter days, the fandom had split between like the Superman film franchise fans, and then there was this little tiny show on the WB at the time called Smallville, which was
just a little
show called Smallville, which I was a huge fan of. I've talked about on the Nerds of Color podcast multiple times. And the original incarnation of this podcast was about, like, I wanted to talk about DC on TV, ultimately merged into DC films. But Smallville, huge fan.
Right.
I wanted them to turn that into a movie, to be completely honest.
Right.
And I think that's why I had negative feelings going into Superman Returns, because it was like 2006. It was right after the 5th season of Smallville. The creators of Smallville had originally had a 5-year plan. And they won't say this. I've actually asked Al Goff, y'all wanted to do movies after the 5 years. He was like, he's non-committal. But I'm pretty sure they said 5-year plan and then do movies like the Star Trek franchise used to do.
But I think part of the problem with that was, if you listen to Tom Welling's podcast, like, he didn't want to. Like he if you listen to either like his appearances on what's his face?
Michael Rosenbaum. Yeah.
Michael Rosenbaum. Yeah, yeah. I forget the name of the podcast. I enjoy it, but I forget the name of the podcast.
Yeah, Inside of You, and then they do a whole Talkville,
yes,
which is the
yes.
yeah.
So he's talked about it multiple times. Like he never wanted to put on the costume.
Yeah, I know, and I the no flights, no tights rule of Smallville was what brought Tom Welling into it, and but
Yeah.
you know, in my heart of hearts, if we could have like just had them do the 5 years where he's in high school and then jump into movie, because to me, Michael Rosenbaum, Erica Durance,
Right,
are such great Lex and Loises that I just wanted to see them on the big screen. Neither here nor there. We ultimately got what we got, and that's what we'll talk about.
I do want to say one more thing about our time on superhero hype, which I did no, because I did enjoy. Like I miss message board culture.
Yeah,
in a way, like you have more immediacy with like Twitter and Blue Sky and whatever platform. I mean, I know people are still using Mastodon, God knows why, but but it wasn't just a divide of Smallville versus something new. There was a contingent that was dead set against doing anything new with like anything. Like if it wasn't Christopher Reeve, they would torch the entire place to the ground. Like
and ultimately I feel like that's kind of what dooms Superman Returns.
I think so too. I think that the want to continue the story became precedent for Warner Brothers in particular, because they wanted to bank on, and as they do continuously with these properties even now, like it's always about banking on known quantities.
Nostalgia.
Christopher Reeve is a known quantity. Having a Superman that's similar to Christopher Reeve, I
mean, literally continuing the story of Superman 2.
Literally continue, but doing it in such a way that it came off creepy.
Oh, super creepy. Yeah, we'll get into that. That's one of my biggest like red flags with this movie is like Superman's such a fucking creep.
Professional artists and professors, maybe a nerd who's just like you, talking about the things that you like too. So I invite you to the NOC. In full color, you see me. The hard knock life, comics, movies, and TV. Yeah, pop culture with a different perspective. Watch it on your screen, hit play, so check this.